Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Simon Mustoe has a lifelong love of wildlife and of watching how animals make ecosystems work. It's not enough, Simon says, to simply know animals exist. We have to recover our natural instincts and sense their significance as part of the processes for human survival and well-being. Simon's first book, Wildlife in the Balance: Why Animals Are Humanity's Best Hope, was published in 2022. Today I'm talking to Simon Mustoe about his latest book, How to Survive the Next 100 Years, Lessons from Nature. Simon, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you, Greg. Nice to be here.
When I first began reading and researching this book, that led me to a statement which appears on the reverse on your press release and on your Facebook page. It reads, "Ecologist and naturalist Simon Mustoe shows us how to consume a more balanced variety of knowledge to become healthier and happier by reconnecting with nature." Now, that's a big statement. What does it mean?
Okay, so hopefully by the time people have read the book, they'll understand the answer. But in a nutshell, everything that we do as humans and everything animals do as animals collides in the most incredible way. And that's happening right now in our world. So the news that we consume normally, which is really only half the story, I think everybody who's listening will agree that we mostly consume negative news. It's quite hard to find the positive news. The positive news comes in, I think, two forms. Firstly, that there is an enormous resurgence of wildlife-driven processes around the world at the moment that is happening without us. We're not actually driving that through our decision-making. The animals are doing it themselves. And if you know where to look, you can see that that's happening at a magnitude greater than perhaps has happened in the last 50 years. And then there's the stuff that we're doing. So whilst we're desperately struggling to try to manage and control nature, there's also a lot of things human beings are doing that kind of is in our nature as well, things that policymakers haven't made us do. And one of the examples I give is the growing a veggie patch in your garden. 10 or 15 years ago, hardly anyone did it. Today, almost everyone's doing it. And nobody made a policy about that. And what we're doing is we're behaving and adapting the same as animals. And at the same time, because of the degradation of our landscapes, animals and people are increasingly being thrown together. And whilst that's creating some conflicts, it's also creating this opportunity and reality that we're having encounters with animals, and it's changing the way we view ourselves, and it's changing the way that animals view us and each other. And it's creating, I think, a monumental shift in our relationship with nature worldwide.
Let's talk about one of those words in that statement, ecology. What is it? How does it work? Is it a process? Is it a process to a state of equilibrium or some sort of permanency? Is it a self-correcting process? Is it a state of flux?
Ecology, in essence, is the relationship between animals and their environment. Okay, so it's obviously an enormously complex subject, something that people find hard to get their head around. In fact, I would say it's taken me 30 years to kind of become comfortable with this concept. It is dynamic. It's ever changing. We can't say we'd like the ecology to be as it was 10 years ago. It will always be something that is different in the future. How it works, how do I explain this simply, is that patterns of ecology sort of fall back into a state of stability. And they fall into a state of stability because the world around is constantly forcing it apart. So the classic example is a sand dune or sandcastle. You build a sandcastle on the beach, it falls apart. It's actually only an animal that can enable a sandcastle to remain. Now, the natural sandcastles are sand dunes, and they're pyramidal. And so it doesn't matter how much force you put onto sand. You can be the most violent gale force winds. They will just form bigger pyramids, bigger and bigger. That's the most stable structure. And throughout the planet, there are examples of these structures that, due to an outside influence, so it's a bit counterintuitive, breaking everything, constantly collapsing it, the most stable structures survive. And it turns out that those most stable structures, when it comes to the life-giving elements of an ecosystem are created almost entirely by animals, and they represent themselves in water, food, soil structure, stable climate, and so on and so on.
Part of the premise of this book is that many or most people haven't caught up with the facts about the state of our society. The example you point to is one of a suite of questions posed to the public by scholar Hans Rosling, which was, how did the percentage of people living in extreme poverty change in the last 20 years? Now, I immediately thought, as most people would have thought, well, it's gotten worse.
Well, according to Hans Rosling, and the facts, it hasn't. And so the premise of this question I raised in the book is that we are always about 20 years behind the 8 ball when it comes to our understanding of current knowledge. And so when it comes to conservation and our thoughts about where our planet is going, we have this negative view because we've been fed that in the news. Rosling's experiment, as you know, culminated in him asking those questions of people all over the world, and almost every nation and every attempt to get those multiple choice questions answered resulted in humans getting it catastrophically wrong. In fact, the best results he got was when he went to the zoo and asked the chimpanzees. So multiple choice questions with 3 answers. Is it going up, staying the same, or going down? And the chimps got it right a third of the time, because as he put it, they don't watch the news, and humans would get it right, say 5% of the time. So there's a question around how living animals in our planet are being affected at the moment by degradation of the environment, and we largely assume that most animal populations are declining. And in fact, that's the premise in the Living Planet Index, which reports a 75% reduction in the populations of all animals worldwide. But it turns out that that data is statistically invalid to some degree, and it's probably closer to half the animals going up and half going down, which tells a very different story. Because like, if you live in your house, if you looked in the pantry today and 3/4 of your food was gone, right, you would probably go to the shops. But if half the food in your pantry was actually increasing and half was going down, that would pose a very different situation. You might not need to go shopping. I mean, so you can literally have the opposite connotation and conclusion drawn depending on small changes and variations in the data. So the idea of this is that we are seeing some really positive outcomes in our connection with nature, in animal populations, in ecosystems. We know that almost every attempt to remove threats and restore populations has resulted in very rapid rebuilding of ecosystem processes and positive change, but that rarely gets reported. So a lot of our information we consume is well out of date, and it will take a few more years to challenge that. And I'm hoping that the writing and discussions we're doing now will be part of that process of improving people's mental health as well, because as we get more confident, we will not only be happier, but also more likely to want to be involved in facilitating some of that change in our local areas.
So let's talk about rebuilding ecosystems. And one of the very first examples you use in your book, and that supports your theory, is that of the indigenous Gunditjmara people of Western Victoria and the consequences of a visit to the Bujbim Cultural Centre that you experienced. Tell me about that experience.
In Western Victoria, we have a World Heritage Area. Regrettably, I wasn't really aware of this until quite recently. And World Heritage Areas are important, right? So Machu Picchu, the pyramids, all these places that we understand and equate with important human heritage. And it turns out that we've got one of these sites in our own, in fact, it's one of 2 sites in Victoria, the other one being an urban site in Melbourne. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I should go and find out a bit more about this. And what's important about this particular site is that, unlike most other World Heritage places in the world, it's actually an example of a living infrastructure that's still being used. So the traditional owners of that landscape for tens of thousands of years have been modifying that landscape to create an aquaculture system to enable eels to thrive. Now, eels are a migratory species. They migrate up to the Coral Sea and they come back to after spawning into our local waters, and they're full of nutrients. So if you start to create a tapestry of waterways and ponds and so on, the natural death of those eels and your consumption of them actually contributes enormously back to local ecosystem condition. And for a long, long period of time, human beings lived comfortably with that particular resource providing food, water, and almost everything that was needed to survive. Shelter, obviously, in the form of a better ecosystem, producing trees and firewood and building materials and so on. So we've actually got this amazing example of a really good human wildlife ecosystem interaction in our own neighborhood. And what's most remarkable is that the knowledge and connection to that still exists today. There are still people within our own society who are living those lessons from nature, and you can tell that story, and it's actually quite an incredible experience to go and hear about it.
And from that experience, you draw the very first of many lessons that you point to in this book. It is still possible for people and animals to coexist and build life support ecosystems together.
Indeed, indeed it is. And we, of course, in Australia live in one of the luckiest countries. So we're a megadiversity country with a westernized society who are erudite and obstinate and stubborn. And Australians have a very driven to survive. And so we have not only the motivation and the expertise to do something with this, we also are surrounded by a wealth and abundance of wildlife that we can actually value in a different way and use as an opportunity to rebuild lives, ecosystems, and economies.
Here's a phrase we don't hear very often: civilized green turtles. And you link that with lesson number 2. Be like a turtle and create civilizations compatible with the animals that live around you.
So the green turtle's a great example. You look into the eye of a turtle, if you've ever had the delight to do that. Again, Australians are lucky. Like our country is surrounded by turtles. So, a lot of people around the world don't get this chance. If you look into the eye of a green turtle, for example, you see a depth of wisdom and knowledge of millions of years. And it turns out that a lot of those green turtle populations were stable within their ecosystem for far longer than any known Western civilization that we're aware of. Longer, perhaps, even than the indigenous populations here, certainly in parts of Europe and the Mediterranean, outdates the most famous modern civilizations we can think of. And the reason for that is because turtles contribute as much back to their ecosystem as they take from it. And this is a simple fact of ecology, again, that any animal that exists borrows from its ecosystem. And it's so we are naturally both creators and destroyers of what we do, of our surrounding environment. You think we need shelter, food, and water. So the first thing we have to do is go and cut something down to make a house. We might need some firewood. We consume food from the ground or whatever, which removes and destroys processes slightly. And then, of course, we produce waste. Okay, and all animals do that. It's not something we should feel guilty or embarrassed about. And it's quite natural. What we cannot do is offset that process without the assistance of other animals, because there's a cascading effect and we don't sit in this ecosystem alone. So turtles, don't sit there and destroy the environment at the expense of all the other animals that they share that with. They don't have the knowledge or forethought to go and capitalize on that or create an outside economy of it. So they're trapped within this cycle. And again, we can learn from that. I think we can sort of observe these animals and just simply say to ourselves, okay, what is it that we can do better to enable us to have less of a threat to the ecosystem that surrounds us? And animals are the key.
One of several very interesting ideas that arise from this chapter, one that particularly struck me and a question worth considering, is how much of your cost of living, increasing insurance and mortgage debt is driven by local ecosystem collapse?
To answer this question, I like to ask questions. So I'm going to ask you, Greg. The first question I'm going to ask you is, do you, in your spare time, go out and seek time outdoors to offset your work stresses and find a better work-life balance?
Every day.
Okay, all right. So the next question is, would you be able to, if you had to, describe to me the specific features of the ecosystem that enable you to do that? It's different for everybody, but you must look for a particular place that has certain features that you find rewarding, peaceful, whatever.
I suppose the things that I look for are natural features, things that haven't experienced intervention by humans. Of course, we've got pathways into those areas, but what I like to do is sit in an area where I feel that a human hasn't been or hasn't intervened.
And so you're looking for those natural experiences, which is again deeply embedded in your psyche. Okay, it's in your DNA, it's in your brain processes. So the third and most important question then is given that, how does it make you feel?
Well, I feel better. I feel healthier. I feel free. And I suppose that I feel better connected to nature there, particularly when there's no other humans around.
Your personal feelings are one thing, and you share actually with the same kind of values as most people when they connect with the environment. And people have there's various nuances of that. But if we were to look at the sum total of everyone's value they get and the features they look for in the ecosystem, we find that the majority of the values we get for our economy flow through an ecosystem feature. So we can kind of map that, if you like, if we ask enough people. I'm actually doing a project on this right now here in Port Phillip Bay in Melbourne. And what we discover quite shortly after is that actually the majority of our economic resilience, our ability to work, if you like, our ability to make money during the week is determined not by how hard we work today, but how well we can play in the times we have off. And that value is grossly underestimated when it comes to nature. So we take for granted, for instance, the roads outside, and we just assume that tax is going to pay for those to be kept good so that we can get to places and goods can arrive and so on. We should really be having the same economic valuation on nature because it delivers probably a greater level of benefit. In fact, the statistics show us now, and the reason for that globally most countries now are recentering their economies around nature, is that nature restorative actions, so that can be progressive, I'm not talking about going back in time, we can actually make progressive actions to restore nature, contributes $7 to $30 back to our economy, whereas at the moment, because of the loss of nature over the last 50 years, a dollar spent on nature negative actions, so business as usual, is barely able to scrape a dollar back. So we're at this enviable position in our societies right now where the decline in nature over 50 years means that governments who spend a dollar can't quite get a dollar back. And that deficit is paid for in increasing cost of living. And it's paid for in increasing risk to the very things that support our economies and livelihoods, which results in increasing insurance. And if insurance collapses, well, almost everything falls down like a house of cards.
Simon, does that mean that there's nothing we can do to recover from this situation we brought ourselves to?
Well, no, quite the opposite, in fact. And one of the most incredible things happened recently. So there is a company called Swiss Re, and most people won't have heard of them, but they are the insurance company that insure the insurers that insure you. Okay, very big organization. And they published a report which puts Australia on notice as the second highest at-risk countries in the world for biodiversity loss. And the Insurance Council of Australia subsequently have said, if we do not invest in nature restoration, we may not be able to insure people in future. So we're not talking about environmental groups, greenies and whatever. We're talking about some of the most corporatized companies in the world are now saying, we must do this. We must restore this. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you can restore 7 to 30 times more value back into your community by just restoring nature, what that does is it actually empowers local people. But there's another aspect to that. In these very reports, there's a paper hidden. And that paper shows us that by restoring wildlife populations, we can have 10 times more impact than we could by reversing all of the most commonly understood threats, such as global heating, nutrient pollution, and so on. So let me reframe that again. The threats we commonly associate with the greatest impacts on our society, global warming, nutrient pollution, and other pollution, if you add all those together, they will have a less of an impact on our society than the loss of wildlife species from our environment. Now, the great thing about that is that it means that by simply restoring nature and rebuilding wildlife populations into our local areas, local people can have a bigger positive impact on their own local area than they can at the moment. So it's kind of what we've been looking for, because it's very disempowering talking about climate change. That's a positive story too, because just a few days ago, the UK government announced a 24-hour period, 100% renewables. Australia, I think, is at 40% now. Parts of our society are at much higher. So that's happening in the background. It's actually accelerating at this point. So there's a lot to be proud of in that. Even though we think it's going slowly, it's actually going quicker than we imagine. But it's still disempowering, because you and I, what can we do about climate change? Well, not a lot, but in actual fact, what we can do is rebuild climate resilience in our own backyard. Climate resilience that may have actually lost us more in the last 50 years here than our global connotation. So again, when we read the news, we tend to see the negative side and the disempowering and disabling side. When we start to think about wildlife and natural processes, it unlocks this whole new possibility. And there's a lot going on in local areas at the moment, even where I live, which is starting to rebuild that tapestry. And in the next few years, we're going to see some monumental positive changes.
Will humans survive the next 100 years is the final chapter in your book, and I was struck by a slightly amusing statement. The truth is, humans will not destroy Earth. A certain inbuilt incompetence restricts our ability to do as much damage as we might imagine. Ironically, it is our fallibility as a species that gives me the greatest hope for humans. That's a pretty wild statement.
It is, but it's an important one, because there's another statement that says that we're happy to put our faith in our technology to fix everything. And we also think that our technology is capable of destroying everything. But we're not that powerful. And so when we talk about these various insidious ways that nature controls us, we've already touched on some of the ways that our behavior is already changing for reasons we can't actually explain. Well, there are many more reasons why nature holds us to account that have never been researched and we're not aware of. And so we kind of go along in a sort of hodgepodge way, thinking that we're doing the right thing and we're making decisions that are beneficial when we really don't know if they're beneficial or not. But if you put that aside, overall, things seem to be heading in a different direction altogether for reasons that we can't explain, that are outside of us. So once we start to understand the limitations of our own ability, our fallibility, it's a humbling exercise to understand that nature is bigger than us. And this is also happening in political systems. So there's a lot of people now questioning the money we've spent on environmental programs in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, and how a lot of that's not achieved any kind of positive outcome whatsoever. So people are beginning to dig around and go, well, there must be a way to do this. And if we take rewilding as an example, and rewilding means different things to a lot of people, and it's not the only thing to do, but let's take that as one example. What we've learned from rewilding, the lessons from nature from that, is that the fastest path to restoring natural processes is to remove the threats that we are placing on the environment through our behavior. And often that's just small changes that don't change our lives much. We're just slightly different way of behaving. Nature restores ecosystems remarkably fast. So within, say, 5 to 7 years, you can see complete change. And as an example, the Tiverton project in Western Victoria that was founded alongside the Rothwell Sanctuary with Nigel Sharp has reintroduced eastern barred bandicoots into farmland, and in just a few years has restored soil processes. You're talking about large-scale economic costs of weed management and fence replacement due to flooding being almost eradicated entirely by reintroducing a small mammal back into the landscape. But equally, they've increased the economic output of the sheep farm. The tensile strength of the wool in the valley has gone up. And they haven't done it by going in and interfering with the bandicoots. They've just let them go about their job. And this is an example of what we're finding iterated across almost every landscape where animals are put back in. We actually don't know what the outcome will be, but we do know it will be better. And so another example of that is the researchers working on the wolves in Yellowstone Park. So everyone's heard the story about introduced wolves and they changed the dynamic of the system and rivers changed their course. And everyone's like, oh, wow, how did wolves manage to do that? It's a complex relationship between wolves and herbivores and so on. The question the scientists have been asking, is that good or bad? And no one can work it out, because they're like, well, if a river changes course, that could be bad for humanity, right? And so there's arguments going on as to whether introducing wolves is good or bad. Well, the scientists have discovered that life is too short to even work that out, that actually we're never going to be able to prove that one way or the other. But the same scientists are also saying, but obviously we can't have a system without wolves, right? Because a system without wolves doesn't work. Beth Fulton from CSIRO, who works on ecosystem modeling, told me about sharks. You take sharks out of a marine environment, it collapses like a house of cards. But we can't prove that through empirical data. We can't look at the data and actually see it happening. We can only understand it through modeling and imagine that the wisdom of removing sharks or wolves is a bad thing. So we have to put our faith and trust back in nature. And that's the fallibility I'm talking about. And once we learn how little we know, we start to make wiser decisions.
Let's circle back to the beginning for a moment, and that sense of despair at the start of your book, and the idea that that despair comes from lack of information. Where should we be looking for that information which will turn us into a more positive, forward-looking society?
So to find real hope, and this isn't hope for the hope's sake, this is actual genuine things happening. My first advice is to turn off your phone. Stop reading the news. The second piece of advice is to jump online and start to learn about your local environment. Jump onto iNaturalist, letter I naturalist, do a search of what's around, go and see some things, grab a pair of binoculars, notebook, camera, learn about what's in your local area, first of all. And you'll see straight away that there are actually marvelous and fascinating things happening that are still there, okay? And that gives you a sense of hope to begin with, that wildlife is still going about its business. And then maybe do a search on nature restoration in your local area, or what's actually happening at the grassroots, because I think almost everywhere on the planet now, at a local area, there are examples of this occurring at the community level. And these are sophisticated projects that you can get involved with. And if you don't want to get involved in them, you can at the very least have confidence that it's happening. Okay. And then perhaps just ask yourself a question: what can I do differently, perhaps to alleviate my impact on the local area? And perhaps take solace in the fact that when you do go out at the weekend and you pursue your hobby, that you might be having as much impact on your local economy and your economic resilience as you do during your work life. And you shouldn't feel guilty about that. In fact, you should be able to look forward to, in the coming years, a chance to go and enjoy your local environment, because you've been part of a shift in our relationship with nature, and that nature is now looking after you as much as you're looking after it.
Simon Mustoe, thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you, Greg. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
I've been talking to Simon Mustoe about his latest book, How to Survive the Next 100 Years, Lessons from Nature. It's published by Wild Diaries, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.